Welcome back to Chapter 5, Part 2, our examination of culture. As we started out, we identified some of the traits of culture, how culture is very diverse. There are co-cultures within cultures, and the aspect of how culture can be a basis for some of our prejudices and our biases as well. Also helps us with our sphere of influence, as well as our in-groups and out-groups that we talked about. Now, let's go deeper into how our prejudices can break down our communication with others. In 1973, there was a study done by Ward, Zana, and Cooper that took a look at the noise aspect of prejudice in the interaction between people of different races. In this study, they had white students act as a job interviewer for either a black student, another university student, or a white student. And what they found is that there was definitely noise being created even when the interviewer was unaware of their own biases or prejudices that they may have. They showed that the actual race ended up causing noise in the communication model that reflected in less intimacy, higher rates of speech errors, and shorter interview times. So let's go back into that communication model and see where things broke down. Now, we actually start in the encoding process. When we're coming up with what to say, our biases and prejudices start altering how we're encoding a message. And that throws the whole system off. Let's look at the mechanics of it. With encoding, we want to make our messages shorter, closed-ended, and at times condescending. And all these are happening not because we want them to, but because we have a prejudice or a bias. And we make the message shorter because we're uncomfortable in the contact. We're uncomfortable in the situation. Closed-ended because if we ask an open-ended question, we have to listen to a response. Meanwhile, if it's closed-ended, a yes or no is the only response we get. Condescending is because we have created an image of who this person is before they have presented themselves. And so we already figure they're part of a subgroup, not a co-group. And less interaction. And this is going to come up in multiple aspects. When encoding, I've already been messed up. Okay, we've encoded what we're wanting to say, and rather than saying it, we've kind of garbled it and threw in some prejudice, threw in some shortness, kind of messed up our message. We're then going to try to spit it out and get it out to the other person, and it becomes worse. We have errors that come up, and we have other problems. Miscommunication due to nonverbal occurs as well. In the Ward study, the nonverbal signals included lack of eye contact. Now, I know we have talked about how we each have our own different communication style, and in some cases we're lookers, we're listeners, or we're touchers, and so eye contact isn't natural for everyone. However, within a social setting of an interview, we have social expectations of the interviewer and interviewee, and one of those within our Western culture is to make eye contact, and lack of eye contact we actually attribute to not paying attention. So even if you're not a looker, you have a tendency still, when expected, to make that eye contact to reassure the process. Moving away from the person, where you actually create a physical distance. Meanwhile, if the student was of the same race, they actually moved in and signaled a different indication in their nonverbal messaging, as well as open versus closed. And these can actually send important clues and signals to an interviewee as to whether or not they should be enthused about the job, their opportunity at the job. Number of things are being spoken here that are messing up the message that we're sending them. Prejudice changes how we message is decoded as well. We don't listen to hear to understand or comprehend, we listen to cherry pick. That's what the little kitty cat there was doing, was cherry picking, and which means we were looking for confirmation. We want to be right. So even if we're not aware of our prejudices or our biases, they have a need to be correct. And so we change how we're listening to someone. That's that self-fulfilling prophecy we talked a little bit about, how we expect something of someone, so we help them to be that. And we do that through our listening, where instead of hearing what they're saying, we're just waiting for that cherry so we can pick at it. Time and time again, the point of the message is lost between the sender and the receiver. And that's because we're more concerned about being right than actually about making that connection. And that's one of the reasons why, no matter what group we find ourselves in, what culture we come from, or what culture another person comes from, we need to start working towards where we put those aside to actually make a true connection with an individual. Communication and prejudice. Let's talk about fixing it. And this isn't necessarily the only fix. This is just an approach to finding a solution. Part of it does start with what we've already spoken about through the first chapters of this book. Self-reflection. When we leave a situation, kind of looking back and saying, well, how did I handle myself in there? Did I come across correctly? Did I have to put on a mask? Or was it a face where I was showing some of my authentic self, but it was a social construct of my authentic self, or was I my authentic self? Now, very rarely in social situations we have authentic self, but we know when you have that mask on. Knowing yourself, overcoming prejudice must include cognitive choices. And sometimes that's shouting down the inner voice in you. The inner voice that has that prejudice. The inner voice that has the bias, that may have came from your cultural upbringing, that may have been part of your entire life. But now you need to learn to kind of say, oh, wait a minute, I'm not listening for content. I need to stop and listen for content. And part of what we want to do is we want to look at our own culture. Are we an individualistic culture or a collectivism culture? If we're an individualistic culture, we tend to promote the individual over the team, let's just say. Personal statistics, personal home runs versus the team's winning percentage type of thing. We find this oftentimes in the US, Canada, New Zealand, Sweden, where we really want to look at the individual success. Meanwhile, if we're from a collectivist culture, we tend to emphasize the group success. So when we're talking to someone, we need to realize what group we're in and kind of determine what type of group they're coming from. Once again, this is coming back to listening to what they're saying versus if they're only talking about their achievements, well, they could be from an individualistic culture. Meanwhile, if they talk about, well, the last company I came from, we achieved best sporting goods store in the Western United States. They're talking about team success. And so you start to realize, oh, well, we need to look at that as part of the dynamics. We need to understand that we try to avoid uncertainty within our communication. And it depends partially on our culture. Some people really don't grow up in a culture that likes uncertainty. If you've ever visited Germany, for instance, if the train says it's going to leave at 12 o'clock, it will leave at 12 o'clock. If you're there at 12:01, then guess what? The train has left. High uncertainty avoidance cultures, people place value on control. So they want to make sure everything happens exactly as it says it is. And once again, Germany comes up there, Greece, Mexico, Japan are all those. Now, low uncertainty avoidance, this is a cultural aspect where, okay, you're interviewing that person, you're trying to hire them for a job. If they are from a high uncertainty avoidance, then they will be there right on time, 5 minutes before, that type of thing. Low uncertainty, they have a tendency to be, well, we're going to have dinner 5-ish, and they eat dinner at 7. And it's where they kind of go with the flow without controlling it. You see this in Jamaica, Denmark, Sweden, Ireland. These are all kind of places where you'll find that. Now, we're going to break away from the text again, as I tend to do. But what I want you to realize, you should break away from what I teach you as well. Because you're going to be the person interpreting this information and utilizing it in your life. So modify it to fit what you need. The text is focusing primarily on aspects of religion, regional political systems, geography. That is their big push when they start talking about cultures. But we already know there's cultures within cultures within cultures, and there are so many co-cultures that it's really a very diverse aspect of culture. It is good to understand if a culture is high or low context when you're interacting with it. Because if I tell someone from Germany I'm going to be there at 5 p.m., I better be there at 5 p.m. Meanwhile, if I tell someone, hey, I'm going to come over after work, and they're from one of those where they don't place a whole lot of importance on, punctuality, after work could be any time from 3:30 to 7, and they're okay with it. Emotional displays. You also need to learn from culture. Is your culture comfortable with emotional displays or uncomfortable with it? And how are you going to interact with those from different cultures that have a different view? There's also masculinity versus femininity, which will play into it. Certain cultures have different views of it. If you're talking about the old Western United States culture versus the Southern culture or the Northern culture, once again, you're going to regional aspects, but the rugged frontiersman, that was always the image for the Western, So you'll kind of get those type of views of time, world-mindedness, if they have a world perspective or just a local perspective. These are all important parts that add up to a culture. And once again, we can go back to our music example. When you're talking about, let's say, jazz music, how they dress and how they present themselves and their music comes across differently than if we're talking about grunge rock, for instance. And so there's a different aspect if you want to interact with that culture. When encountering people from here within the United States, remember not to predetermine a person's culture based on your stereotypes. This is something we need to really learn, is that we can't look at a person and say, this is their culture. They have cowboy boots on, they are cowboys, and so this is exactly how they're going to act, and this is what they're going to do. They won't like rock music, and they sure won't like jazz. You never know. So what you have to really do when you're starting to communicate across cultures is to let people teach you their culture, teach you what they think. And that means putting those biases and the prejudices back and listening. Instead of allowing a person to communicate their culture, show respect. And that's one of the biggest things you can do, is go back to that old adage of, we have 2 eyes and 2 ears and 1 mouth. So we look twice as often, we hear twice as much, and we say half. And that's kind of what we need to do when we're letting people teach us their culture, is let them show us what they believe and what their culture is. Benjamin Boone's intergroup dialogue outlines requirements for materials of intergroup dialogue. First, there must be a willingness to take the risk of a perspective might be altered. So when we're learning about another person's culture, we have to push aside our prejudices, and we have to push aside our biases, and we have to be ready to learn. We might learn something. That's one of the risks we take with intercultural communication. Second, the process of dialogue could alter our view of ourselves. Once after we start learning and we suddenly realize, wow, I was wrong with that bias. I was totally wrong about these people. I didn't know anything about it. And suddenly your view of yourself is like, wow, I really did have biases and I really had to overcome those. So we might change our view of ourselves. Dialogue is nonlinear when we're in a room. I mean, if we're doing a podcast, it can be linear, but then we're not really experiencing someone else's cultures. We're projecting our own. So dialogue is unpredictable and it's nonlinear, which means, you might expect, oh, I'm going to go in there and impress them with my knowledge of their culture, and you walk in the door and you find out that your knowledge of their culture was more limited than you thought, and you kind of made a fool of yourself, but that's okay. What you need to do instead is just step back and realize, hey, I can't predict. I have to learn. Those engaging dialogue need to keep in mind their tension is unavoidable. There is going to be a tension, and it's unavoidable, but how we deal with it is not. So if we've chosen that, okay, if things should get, should be a tense moment. We see this in families that are split between political parties. Boy, I gotta go to Thanksgiving dinner, and boy, the in-laws are of this, and I'm this, and you automatically know there's going to be tension. It's unavoidable. But you might find out something neat if you can listen through that tension and let them teach you, and you teach them. Sharing. It goes back to the phenomenological approach that we talked about before of taking other people's perspectives. And by taking other people's perspectives, we start to see ourselves differently, we see them differently, and we start to have authentic, genuine communication without the mask. Now, these two gentlemen, I actually sat in their classroom. They are really great people. I enjoy them. They teach here at the University of Northern Colorado. They've published multiple books on intercultural, interfaith relationships and about the approach for communication in it. And what Dr. Keaton and Dr. Sukup really liked talking about was how we have tenets in pluralistic dialogue. Pluralistic just means that we're taking the other perspective. We're being open, involves moving beyond acknowledgement of differences in understanding. And let's go ahead and examine that. Pluralism requires engagement of the other, which means we have to bring down our defenses. Pluralism focuses on cultural experiences communicated through narrative. And that's how we communicate. There's going to be narrative involved. There's going to be nonverbals, but a lot of it is how they express themselves. And since we've taken down our defenses and we're letting them in, we're hearing. Pluralism requires empathetic listening. In other words, once again, we're listening to understand, not to judge or not to confirm our biases. And pluralism neither presumes nor requires a person to adopt a central assumption of a culture. In other words, just because you've let someone from a different culture share with you doesn't mean you have to end up adapting and becoming part of their culture. And that leads us to another important aspect, is that when we're shifting towards co-cultures, we're also not taking away from their culture. In other words, we don't say all religions are the same. We don't say all cultures are basically the same. Why? Because that takes away the diversity of those. Instead, celebrate them for their uniqueness, which enriches everyone's life. I mean, if I just say, boy, all punk rockers are so different than grunge rockers. There's no way I could ever possibly get along with them. Unless I say, the two musics are basically rock, so they're basically the same, in which case I'm not getting that Seattle experience, or I'm not getting that London experience from the punk rockers. We're taking away their beauty and their uniqueness and blending them down to make them palatable. I like spicy food, so I don't like blending anything down. Pluralism conceives of religious differences as an opportunity. That's the important thing. When we're experiencing another culture, we don't have to do it begrudgingly. It's like if you're taking this class and you're just doing it for the credits, I'm sorry, that's not good. That's not what I want. What you want is an opportunity to gain insight. is an opportunity to see something miraculous and to experience something different. And that's what you want to do. Pluralistic dialogue focuses on beliefs rather than culture. And this is once again when they're telling you, rather than, because when we start talking just cultures versus belief, we're talking about our generalizations. Meanwhile, if we let the person tell us what they believe within that culture, then you're getting a more deeper understanding of it than if you would just go in and try to make it bland. Pluralism requires communication climate in which cultural differences and disagreements are interpreted as learning opportunities. Once again, there's that learning opportunities. It always is. If you have a difference with a person, it's not a difference to overcome them. It's not an opportunity to convert them or bring them down. It is an opportunity to actually see their perspective. And that brings us back to our risk of you might change through it. When we get later into discussions, I'm going to bring up Sonia Foss, and she's actually a professor at the University of Colorado, Denver. But we're going to talk about invitational rhetoric, and that's another area that I really enjoy talking about, and that's what this partially references. So what we wanted to talk about today was culture, understanding culture. We created a definition of it. We understand that culture is not just regional, it's not just religious, it's just not ethnic, it's just not, actually, there are so many cultures that we're part of that oftentimes we don't even realize it. And for that reason, we don't define culture just based on, oh, well, that's from northern Colorado, that's southern Colorado, and that's how we're going to divide up the culture. No, we suddenly realize it's a very dynamic aspect of life, that we have many cultures that we live, that we have learned, that we are communicating, that we're experiencing, and that we're sharing. So all those aspects fall into it. We talked about prejudice. Prejudice is a big part of how we perceive others. Cultures do go into that in-group, out-group like we talked about. Individualism versus collectivism will change how a culture presents itself. And communication across cultures. And we realize that self-reflection from chapter 2 is still hanging in there as the number one thing that we need in interpersonal communication. Because if we can reflect upon ourselves, then we are more open to change and we are more open to taking perspective of others. And meanwhile, if we never reflect on ourselves, we become closed off and walled in. And if, once again, you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me and let me know. Post what you think here. Post any type of cultural experience you've had, an opportunity you've had perhaps to travel to another country and experience the culture versus see it on television. I've heard a lot of people that have traveled here from other countries and other regions of the world that were amazed that we don't have running gunfights in the streets with Starsky and Hutch. Oh boy, that was a bad 70s TV show reference. But we're not living in the world of Die Hard or The Terminator or any of these other things. That our culture is actually much more complex than that.